My mother erased my name from the family list and told everyone I died overseas so I wouldn't ruin the reunion. Those were the first words I heard about myself the moment I stepped onto the walkway outside the Knoxville banquet hall after 14 months deployed in a place I still cannot name. I had barely taken 10 steps when a distant cousin stared at me as if I were a ghost rising from the asphalt and whispered, "I thought you died in Afghanistan, your mother told us." The air left my lungs. I stood there with my duffel still slung over one shoulder, smelling of dust and jet fuel, listening to my own death being repeated to my face like it was a harmless misunderstanding. I walked inside anyway because after 6 months of silence from my mother, I needed to see for myself what I had been erased from. The first thing I noticed was the seating chart taped to the wall. My name had been printed, once then crossed out in thick black ink. My chair inside the banquet room sat empty, pushed against a wall as if someone had shoved it away in disgust. And then I saw her. My mother stood with perfect posture, as if hosting a charity gala instead of a family reunion. When her eyes met mine, she didn't gasp or smile or show a flicker of relief. She looked annoyed that I had survived the drive from Fort Campbell. "You weren't supposed to come," she said. "You ruin everything." I felt heat crawl up the back of my neck, but before I could speak, Kayla, my older sister, glided in front of me the way she always has. "Stop pretending you're some kind of hero. Nobody cares." Her voice carried across the room. Heads turned. Conversations lowered. A boy no older than 10 tugged his mother's sleeve and asked in a whisper, "Is she the crazy soldier you told me about?" Every pair of eyes landed on me like I was the problem, the troublemaker, the disappointment who dared to exist in uniform. I stepped back once, trying to steady myself, while humiliation pressed against my ribs. The last time these people saw me, I shipped out quietly, hugging my mother goodbye even when she barely lifted her arms. That was before she decided telling people I had died was less embarrassing than admitting her middle daughter had chosen a life she didn't understand. I kept my mouth shut even then because I have learned the hardest way that silence is often safer than honesty in a toxic family. So I swallowed everything and watched them act like I was an intruder wandering into someone else's celebration. They knew nothing of the truth. They didn't know the only reason I had been given leave was because command insisted I step away after a 14-month classified operational cycle that stretched me to the bone. They didn't know I had spent the last months leading teams through situations no one here could imagine. They didn't know the name Ghostline belonged to me, the one whispered in briefing rooms whenever they needed someone to craft a plan no one else could see. They didn't know I was the youngest tactical scenario architect ever selected by Special Warfare, or that CENTCOM had written my name in a commendation that still felt unreal. And they didn't know I had returned with a secret no one here deserved to hear. To them, I was still Blair, the odd one, the intense one, the failure who left home at 18, after my mother threw my duffel onto the porch and told me not to come back until I learned to be normal. They didn't know that the Army didn't break me. It built me in all the ways my family never cared to. I saw my seat being used as a purse holder. I saw the slideshow titled "Family Achievements" begin without a single picture of me. I saw the faces of people who believed I died because my mother thought that version of the story was cleaner. She lifted a glass, preparing to toast what she called family unity, and I felt the ground inside me shift. I almost walked out. Almost. But then the sound hit, the heavy stop of a military Humvee rolling to a halt outside. It cut through the laughter. It cut through every lie in the room. A soldier burst through the doors, slightly out of breath, scanning the crowd until his eyes locked on me. "The base commander is here. He's asking for someone." My mother snorted, probably looking for Kayla's husband. People chuckled. The doors opened again, and silence dropped into the room like cold water. Colonel Everett Ross stepped inside. His presence shifted the air, his uniform sharper than the chandeliers overhead. He looked directly at my mother, then at Kayla, then past both of them until his gaze found me. His voice didn't rise, yet it sliced through the hall with absolute clarity. Where is Captain Blair Harlow?" The room froze. My mother's glass slipped in her hand. Kayla's mouth opened without sound. And for the first time that night, I didn't feel erased. I felt seen. I grew up in a house where my existence was treated like an inconvenience, a shadow pressed against the wall, while the spotlight never once drifted away from my older sister Kayla. She was the golden one, with the soft hair and the easy smile, and the way our mother carried her victories like trophies polished for guests. And I learned early that perfection had a name, and it wasn't mine. Whenever Kayla entered a room, our mother lit up with a pride so blinding it made everything else fade, and whenever I entered the same room, her eyes sharpened as if preparing for a problem, a disruption, a disappointment waiting to happen. She used to say things like, "Blair is too intense," or "Blair is too masculine," or "Blair is just not built for success," and every sentence landed like a judgment already written before I ever had the chance to prove otherwise. While Kayla joined dance teams and cheer squads and school committees, I hid in the library reading books about battlefield strategy and historical operations, and every time my mother caught me, she sighed the way people sigh when something confirms their fears, calling my interest strange, and telling me I would never fit anywhere if I kept acting like that. And Kayla encouraged it by rolling her eyes dramatically and telling everyone that I lived in my own little soldier fantasy, the kind no one needed to take seriously. I remember the day Kayla tore my English essay, a piece I had spent an entire week writing. She said she needed more space on the kitchen table for her project. The sound of paper ripping felt louder than her voice. And when I confronted her, she shrugged and told our mother I had left my things lying around, and my mother believed her, instantly saying, if I valued my work, I would take care of it better. And that lesson sank deep. Anything of mine could be destroyed, and I would still be the one blamed. By the time I turned 18, my mother had already decided the life she wanted for me. She pushed nursing brochures into my hands, insisting that a normal job would fix my attitude and make me more acceptable. Normal was her favorite word, a word that never seemed to apply to me, and when I told her I had no interest in nursing, she exploded with a fury that seemed too big for a conversation at the dinner table. She shouted about sacrifice and family and loyalty, while Kayla sat nearby pretending to be heartbroken at the chaos I caused. And that night, my mother shoved my duffel bag out the door and told me to find someplace else to sleep until I learned respect the winter air bit into my skin. But it was the sting of her rejection that changed the entire trajectory of my life. I spent 2 weeks bouncing between couches until I realized I needed something solid, something entirely my own, and the Army became that answer. I walked into the recruiting office without hesitation, signing the papers with a steadiness I had never felt in my own home. And even though my mother pretended not to care, she arrived uninvited on my graduation day from basic training. Wearing a stiff smile that did not reach her eyes, she looked at my uniform like it personally offended her and leaned in close enough for her perfume to sting my nose as she whispered, "Do not embarrass us." Hide your rank, as if the stripe on my shoulder was shameful instead of earned, as if my effort would damage her reputation more than her cruelty ever had. That was the moment something inside me began to close. Not in anger exactly, but in self-preservation. The way a wound seals itself before the bleeding becomes fatal. I kept trying to stay connected to them, sending messages on holidays or calling when I had downtime, but every conversation was a reminder that my mother wished I were someone else, someone softer, someone who looked good, standing next to her at church or at family dinners, someone who did not spend nights in the field, mapping terrain and planning scenarios, someone who did not exist in the shadows of operations most people never hear about. Over the years, the distance grew without words not spoken, but lived every time Kayla announced another promotion at her office or another milestone achieved. Our mother celebrated like royalty had arrived, while my updates were brushed aside like irrelevant background noise. And though I kept trying to ignore the instinctive pull inside my chest that whispered, "You will never be enough for them," I still reached out, because some part of me hoped the next call would be different, that the next visit home would feel less like stepping onto enemy ground. But the truth never changed, and when I stood in that banquet hall on the night of the reunion and heard the whispers about my supposed death, the lies my mother had chosen instead of my reality, I understood that the seed planted in childhood had finally grown into something undeniable. This family had never wanted me unless I stayed silent, small, and invisible, the version of me they could control, and the version of me that existed now, Captain Blair Harlow, with experience carved into my bones and a reputation the Army trusted more than my own blood ever had, was someone they would rather pretend had died. This was the injustice that shaped everything that would come next, the quiet cruelty that built the steel beneath my calm, the reason I no longer bowed my head when they spoke, because surviving this family had been the first battlefield I ever learned to fight on. 1 week before the reunion, I learned the truth without even being present, because Kayla's voice carried farther than she intended, as she stood in our mother's kitchen and said with a careless laugh, "You actually told everyone she died," and my mother answered with a softness she never used on me, saying, "I told them it was easier that way," and the words hit me days later, like a punch to the ribs, when I replayed the call in my head while driving toward Knoxville. The morning of the reunion, the sky low and gray, as if mirroring the feeling in my chest. And by the time I reached the parking lot outside the Knoxville banquet hall, I already sensed the atmosphere inside would be colder than the weather itself. The hall held nearly 200 people from different branches of the family tree, yet somehow my existence managed to be the only one treated like an inconvenience. I had barely stepped 3 feet inside before my mother lunged forward, gripping my wrist and pulling me into a dim corner where the noise of chatter softened just enough for her to whisper, with sharp irritation, "Take off that uniform, you look ridiculous." And the command stuck to my skin like ice, as if the fabric of the service uniform I had earned through sweat and danger was nothing more than a childish outfit to her. She examined me with a sneer, as if evaluating damage rather than looking at her own daughter, and in that moment I realized she cared more about the optics of my presence than the fact that I was alive, standing inches away from her, carrying stories and scars she never bothered to ask about. Before I could answer, she turned away as if discarding a problem she would deal with later, and that movement opened a narrow path for Aunt Marion to drift closer, her eyes sweeping over my boots and ribbons, with an expression halfway between confusion and disdain as she murmured she came in costume, and the words stung not because of the insult, but because she believed them. Believed that the uniform was pretend, simply because my mother framed it that way. I walked further into the room, trying to find a chair that wasn't occupied or 3 layers removed from the people who once braided my hair during summer picnics. But before I reached an empty seat, a woman I vaguely recognized tugged her son away, whispering, "She's unstable, military, messed her up," and the child watched me with wide eyes as though I were the danger they needed to avoid. Every direction I turned, someone stared too long or too little, with a distance reserved for strangers or caution signs, and though humiliation pressed at my throat, I kept my face calm because years in the Army had taught me how to withstand pressure without folding even when it came from people who should have lifted me instead of crushing me. I found a small seat near the back of the room and tried to settle there, unnoticed, but the hum of conversation quieted as the projector flickered on and Kayla walked confidently toward the front, wearing the practiced smile that our mother adored her heels, tapping across the polished floor. The slideshow, titled "Family Achievements," lighting up behind her in bold letters, and for a moment I allowed myself to hope that maybe one picture, even a single blurry childhood moment, would survive the purge my mother initiated. But as the slides began one after another, I saw Kayla's graduation photos, her promotions, her engagement pictures, snapshots of her at charity races, smiling with friends standing next to our mother in matching sweaters. the applause rising every few seconds as she narrated her accomplishments with the tone of someone who always expected admiration. The slide advanced again, showing a family collage, and I leaned forward, instinctively scanning for myself, but the faces blurred together, without me. Not even the smallest trace of my existence included, and when the next slide appeared, my stomach tightened, because it showed childhood photos of the cousins playing in the backyard. Yet the one picture I remembered being part of now featured a clean rectangle where I had once been cropped out with precision. Someone behind me whispered softly, "I guess Blair wasn't around much growing up," and another voice answered, "Maybe her mother didn't want her in the photos," and I felt something inside me dissolve slowly, like a thread unraveling one fiber at a time. Kayla moved through the years with ease, her life displayed in curated perfection, while mine was erased so thoroughly that even my absence became part of her aesthetic. And when the final slide appeared, a sentimental group shot taken 2 summers ago, I recognized it instantly, because the original version included me sitting on the far left, holding a plate of overcooked barbecue, exhausted from a surprise weekend duty call. But the version Kayla showed had an artfully extended picnic table covering the space where I had been. The audience clapped loudly as she finished, and she took a small bow, glancing in my direction, with a smirk that lasted only a second, but carried enough malice to strip the air from my chest. I sat there absorbing each blow in silence, while humiliation spread through me quietly, not as a flame, but as something colder and heavier, the kind of shame that sinks deep because it is not rooted in a single moment, but in a pattern stretching back years. Yet even as my heart sank, I stayed perfectly still, hands folded, posture, straight expression, calm because the soldier in me knew how to wait, how to endure, how to let the storm pass without revealing what power lay beneath the surface. And though the room celebrated my disappearance as if it were an accomplishment, I kept breathing evenly, quietly, holding the truth close to my chest, knowing that the humiliation they enjoyed so freely would not last, knowing that someday soon the same people who applauded my erasure would be forced to face exactly who they had tried to bury. The laughter that filled the banquet hall after the slideshow still echoed inside my ears as I sat in my corner chair, trying to steady my breathing, and every sound around me felt sharper, because humiliation heightens the senses in a way nothing else does, turning ordinary voices into reminders of every wound that came before. And as I watched Kayla glide back to her table with the confidence of someone who never feared consequences, I felt years of memories pushing to the surface, each one evidence that this night was not an exception, but the natural continuation of a pattern that had shaped my entire life. I remembered Thanksgiving when I was 26, arriving home on a rare 2-day leave, with the uniform I had earned folded neatly in my bag, and my mother meeting me at the door with a stiff smile that did not reach her eyes as she whispered, "Do not come inside wearing that uniform, people will think you are showing off," and the words landed like a slap disguised as advice, turning something I was proud of into something shameful, simply because she decided appearances mattered more than acknowledging who I had become. And when I told her I was not trying to impress anyone, she sighed dramatically the way she always did when she wanted Kayla to overhear and feel superior. That same year, Kayla posted online, "Blair thinks she is special forces in her head," with a laughing emoji attached, a joke that spread fast among the cousins and family friends. And even though none of them knew my real role in the Army or how close their mockery came to brushing against things they were not cleared to discuss, the blow still struck deep, because it showed how quickly they weaponized anything that did not fit their narrow template of acceptable success. While I spent nights planning operations in dim rooms lit by monitors and maps, they spent nights making jokes about me around dinner tables, the kind of jokes that disguised cruelty behind humor. And my mother fed those narratives in subtle ways, excluding me from birthdays, with excuses about scheduling misunderstandings, omitting my name from group texts about Thanksgiving gatherings, forgetting to tell me about my niece's graduation ceremony until the day after she walked the stage, always claiming it was an accident, while her tone carried the satisfaction of someone reinforcing a hierarchy she had established decades earlier. It became normal for me to learn about family events through social media posts, showing everyone gathered around tables filled with food, smiling and relaxed, while I sat in barracks, hundreds of miles away, believing I had simply missed the memo, when in reality they had edited me out long before I could realize it. Those memories throbbed like old bruises as I watched the reunion unfold, each comment and careless glance a continuation of wounds I thought I had already hardened against, yet they still found their mark, because cruelty that comes from blood always cuts deeper than cruelty from strangers. The air inside the banquet hall thickened as dinner plates were passed around, clinking silverware layering over the quiet tension that simmered beneath the surface, and I tried to ground myself by pressing my boots into the carpet, reminding myself of the training I had survived, the nights I had kept teams alive with nothing but instinct and discipline. But then Kayla rose from her seat with a theatrical sigh and the familiar smirk she used whenever she prepared to deliver a blow. She looked across the long table where a group of cousins had gathered their plates, half full, their conversations easy, and she raised her voice just enough to ensure the surrounding tables could hear as she asked, with a mocking curiosity, "So, Blair, are you still cleaning floors on base?" And the pause that followed was brief but sharp, like the moment before a blade makes contact, and then the laughter erupted around her, loud enough that a few people turned in their chairs to watch me absorb it. Someone snorted as if the insult were clever. Another covered her mouth while giggling, and a man across the table laughed so hard he wiped tears from his eyes, saying, "She really thought she would impress us wearing that uniform." The heat crawled up my throat, but I kept my expression still, my fingers curling so tightly around the edge of my napkin that the fabric twisted into a knot. Yet I did not say a word, not because I lacked the strength, but because years of dealing with this family had taught me that silence sometimes offered more power than speaking, that letting their cruelty hang in the air without reaction forced them to listen to the echo of their own pettiness. I breathed in slowly, letting the sound of their mockery melt into the background, remembering every time I had swallowed humiliation just to keep the peace every moment, when I had chosen restraint, because reacting would only feed their narrative that I was unbalanced or dramatic. And as their laughter rose again, I let my mind drift to the operations room where I had spent my last deployment, remembering the calm focus I learned to cultivate when lives depended on it, a discipline far stronger than the childish attempts at belittling happening around me. Still, the sting remained because no amount of training could remove the truth that these people were my blood. The people who should have wanted to lift me higher rather than grind me down, people who once held me as a baby and now treated me like a cautionary tale. The insult lingered like smoke, and the laughter rolled across the room in waves, but beneath it all there was something else brewing inside me. Something steady and controlled, a rising certainty that the night would not end, the way they expected that their amusement would be short-lived, and that the version of me they believed they could humiliate into silence no longer existed. I unclenched my hand slowly, letting my napkin fall flat again, feeling the shift inside my chest, the way a soldier senses a change in the wind before a shift in the mission. And though I stayed quiet, though I kept my gaze down, though I allowed them to believe they had won this, round a part of me sharpened with each insult, preparing for what would come next, knowing that every second of humiliation tonight would only make the reversal more devastating when it arrived. The laughter drifted far behind me as I slipped out of the banquet hall and into the narrow restroom at the end of the corridor, the door clicking softly shut while my breath caught somewhere between my ribs and my throat. And for a moment I simply leaned against the sink, trying to inhale without shaking, because humiliation has a way of tightening the body until even air feels heavy. And when I finally lifted my head to look in the mirror, the reflection staring back at me felt distant. My eyes rimmed with red from holding everything inside my cheeks, tightened from keeping my expression stoic, while every part of me screamed for release. The bright bathroom lights made my uniform look too sharp, almost harsh, as if the mirror were reminding me that the person I had become no longer fit into the small space my family tried to force me into. And I blinked slowly, trying to steady the trembling that kept rising in my chest, not from fear, but from exhaustion, from the emotional weight of standing in the same room as people who celebrated my erasure as if it were a punchline. My palms pressed against the cool porcelain of the sink, and the faint hum of the vent filled the silence, pulling me backward into the memory of my most recent deployment. The one no one in that banquet hall knew anything about, the one that still lived beneath my skin like a second pulse. Only 3 months earlier, I had stood in a half-collapsed building somewhere in northern Syria, dust thick in the air, listening to radio chatter while coordinating a 33-hour extraction involving 6 trapped civilians and an unpredictable militia force closing in, and the weight of responsibility that night felt immense. Every decision calculated with the precision of a surgeon, every hour stretching into the next as fatigue gnawed at my focus. I remembered how my team kept glancing at me, waiting for direction, trusting me with their lives without doubt, and I remembered the moment the last civilian stepped onto the transport and the relief washed over me so suddenly that I nearly collapsed from the release of pressure. Yet I stayed upright because leadership often means being the last person to rest. When I came home, I shared none of that with my family, because operational details stay sealed behind the walls where they belong. But I had tried to tell my mother that the mission went well, hoping she might offer something resembling warmth, and instead she chuckled lightly and said, probably exaggerated, as if survival were a story I embellished, as if the lives saved were fiction. I crafted to make myself seem important, reducing something weighty and real to a minor inconvenience in her day. The memory twisted in my stomach as another wave of humiliation washed over me, and I gripped the edge of the sink tighter, trying to push back the burn spreading behind my eyes. But the voices from the hallway seeped into the restroom through the thin door, pulling me back into the present, anchoring me in the harshness of what was unfolding on the other side. I straightened slowly, wiping beneath my eyes with the back of my hand, but before I could step away from the mirror, another voice carried down the corridor. My mother's voice, unmistakable in its clipped cadence, speaking to someone with a casual cruelty she never directed toward Kayla. I froze because something in her tone felt sharper than the comments she had made earlier, and I leaned just slightly toward the door, allowing the sound to come through more clearly, and then I heard the sentence that sliced through the last pieces of restraint inside me. I told people she died because it is less embarrassing. The words dropped with a dull echo, hitting me in a place deeper than anger, a place that had been tender since childhood, a place shaped by years of small cuts that had now become a wound that would not close. And though my breath hitched for a moment, the emotion that followed was strangely quiet, not explosive rage, but a tight, focused clarity, like the calm that settles over a battlefield before you move. Hearing her confirm what the cousin had told me earlier shifted something beneath my ribs, something that had absorbed humiliation after humiliation until this moment when it finally snapped, not outwardly but inwardly. And instead of collapsing or storming back into the room, I felt a cold steadiness spread through me like armor. I stood straighter, adjusted my uniform, slowly smoothing the fabric with the same care I had used in barracks across the world, and let the truth settle against my spine. The truth that my mother had not just erased me, she had chosen to rewrite my existence as an inconvenience, a flaw, a stain she wanted hidden, even if it meant inventing my death. Yet despite the snap inside me, I exhaled calmly the way I had been trained, controlling the tremble in my hands, letting my heartbeat settle into a slow, steady rhythm, because reacting emotionally in that moment would only feed her narrative, and I refused to give her that power. I looked into the mirror one last time and saw not the girl she tried to diminish, but the soldier, shaped by years of discipline and loss and duties someone forged far away from the smallness of that banquet hall. And as I pushed open the restroom door with controlled ease, I felt no hesitation, only a quiet decision forming in the center of my chest, a decision that would unravel everything she built to hide me, a decision that would begin not with a scream, but with silence sharpened into resolve. I walked out of the restroom with a steadiness that felt almost foreign after the wave of humiliation that had crashed over me. Each step measured, each breath deliberate, and as the corridor widened back into the noise and warmth of the banquet hall, I felt the cold clarity inside me harden into something immovable, something that no amount of cruelty from my family could shake anymore. The moment I crossed the threshold, the laughter dipped just slightly the way sound does when tension enters a room, even if no one can trace its source, and I kept moving through the crowded tables until Kayla appeared directly in front of me with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment, her smile sharp and gleaming under the lights. She blocked my path with an ease that suggested ownership of the space, as if the reunion belonged entirely to her, and said, "Leave. You do not belong in our photos." Her voice loud enough for surrounding tables to hear, and for a split second the younger version of me flickered to life, the one who used to shrink back when she said things like that. But that version had been buried long ago on nights when I stood in the desert coordinating rescues that mattered more than the opinions of anyone in this room. I lifted my eyes to meet hers, fully letting the silence stretch, letting her confidence waver, and when I spoke, the word came out low and sharp. No, not shouted, but delivered with a cold finality that made her expression falter, as if she had never imagined I would refuse her. The conversation around us dimmed slightly. Forks paused mid-air, and I stepped past her without breaking eye contact, feeling her stiffen behind me in disbelief as I walked directly toward the small stage where a microphone stood ready beside a large projection screen still glowing from her earlier slideshow. Kayla scrambled to keep up the click of her heels, fast and frantic now, and as I reached the front of the room, I heard her voice rise behind me, smoothing itself into a false tone of sympathy as she addressed the gathered relatives, saying, "As many of you know, our dear Blair could not be here tonight because she made the ultimate sacrifice during deployment, and I want to honor her memory by acknowledging her dedication to her country." A ripple of murmurs moved through the hall, and I froze not from shock, but from the audacity of hearing my own death, used as a moral accessory to decorate her moment. And before she could finish her sentence, I stepped onto the stage, my movement unraveling her lie mid-breath. Without hesitation, I reached for the microphone she held my hand, closing over it with a calmness that made even Kayla take a step back, and I pulled it from her grasp with a controlled firmness, lifting it just enough for my voice to carry clearly. "I am right here." Those 4 words did not echo loudly, yet they seemed to slice through the room with a precision that stilled every sound. Conversations halted. Chairs creaked mid-shift. Even the clinking of glasses stopped as 200 people turned toward me all at once, and the weight of their stunned silence filled the air like smoke. A few faces paled as recognition settled in others stared as if trying to reconcile my very real presence with the lie they had just applauded, and Kayla stood frozen beside me, her mouth hanging open as if someone had knocked the wind out of her. The lights on the stage warmed my skin, and for a moment I simply inhaled quietly, letting the silence deepen, letting every person in that room feel the magnitude of what they had participated in, the quiet agreement with my erasure, the ease with which they had accepted the story of my death because it was convenient for my mother and flattering for my sister. Then from the center of the room I heard the sharp scrape of a chair, and my mother rose so quickly her wine sloshed over the rim of her glass. Her face flushed with something between fury and panic as she stared at me like a threat she thought she had eliminated. "You were not supposed to come," she said, her voice shaking with rage that betrayed the poise she worked so hard to maintain, and the words hit the room with a force that made a few people shift uncomfortably, her mask slipping in front of all the relatives she spent years impressing. I held her gaze with the same steady calm I used when briefing soldiers before difficult missions, letting the weight of her words settle on everyone present, letting them see what lay beneath the polished exterior she wore for them. The silence deepened again, stretching long enough for the tension to thicken in the air, and though I felt my heart pounding under the fabric of my uniform, I did not waver, because in that moment, the humiliation of the evening shifted into something else entirely, something sharp and clear, and I understood that this was the first time in years my mother and sister were seeing me, not as the disappointment they shaped in their minds, but as the woman I had become, someone who no longer bowed her head when they demanded it. For the first time that night, I was not the one shrinking in the shadows. I was the one forcing them to confront the truth of their own cruelty, the one turning their lies into the spotlight that revealed exactly who they were. The quiet continued to stretch heavy and electric, and beneath it I felt the subtle shift inside me that marked the beginning of a line I would no longer allow them to cross, a boundary forged not from anger, but from painful clarity. And I knew this moment, the moment I stood on that stage saying no for the first time in my life, would change everything that followed. The silence in the hall after my mother's outburst still hung thick in the air when a low vibration rolled through the floor beneath our feet, a muffled rumble that did not belong to the soft music or the clinking glassware or the uneasy shifting of chairs. And before anyone could make sense of it, the sound deepened into the unmistakable growl of a heavy engine pulling up outside the kind of engine that made walls hum and conversations die mid-sentence. A few heads turned toward the entrance as the noise settled into a steady idle, and through the tall windows I saw the faint flash of military headlights cutting across the parking lot, then the unmistakable shape of a Humvee stopping directly in front of the banquet hall, its presence so out of place among the rows of minivans and sedans that even the most uninterested guests straightened in their chairs. 2 soldiers stepped out first, moving with practiced precision as they positioned themselves near the doorway, their posture signaling authority without ever raising their voices, and the room's mood shifted instantly. The earlier cruelty dissolving into confusion and a thread of nervous curiosity, as if no one wanted to admit they suddenly wondered if this unexpected arrival had anything to do with me, the daughter they had just applauded as dead. I stood still on the stage, listening to the faint stomp of boots approaching the sound, rising like a heartbeat, growing louder in the chest, and when the double doors finally pushed open, the hall inhaled as one. Colonel Everett Ross stepped inside with the measured confidence of someone who belonged in every room. He entered his uniform crisp. His expression focused, his presence slicing through the banquet chatter like a cold wind, and his eyes swept across the hall, assessing and dismissing faces within seconds until they landed squarely on mine. He did not hesitate. He did not soften his tone to match the elegant decor or the stunned faces staring back at him. Instead, he spoke with the clarity of a man issuing an order in a command center, saying, "Where is Captain Blair Harlow?" And the question cracked through the room like lightning, splitting open the sky. Conversations halted, mid-syllable forks froze halfway to mouths and chairs scraped softly as dozens of heads snapped in my direction, eyes widening as if this were the first time they had actually seen me all evening, the first time they realized that the uniform they mocked was real, the first time the name they used as a joke carried weight larger than their disdain. I felt the gaze of 200 people pin me in place, yet for the first time that night, I did not shrink beneath it. Instead, I lifted my chin quietly as Colonel Ross crossed the room toward me with the purposeful stride of someone retrieving a highly valued asset, and Kayla staggered a half-step back as he passed her, without acknowledgement, her earlier confidence melting into confusion so sharp it twisted her features. My mother remained frozen where she stood, her wine glass trembling faintly in her hand, the color draining slowly from her face as the weight of the commander's words pressed down on her. And for a moment, I wondered whether she realized the magnitude of what was unfolding, or if she simply feared being exposed as the architect of the lie that had shaped the entire evening. Colonel Ross reached the foot of the stage, then stopped and faced the hall, removing a folded envelope from inside his jacket with a deliberate calm that amplified the tension until the entire room felt suspended in a moment that might never end. "I've been dispatched to deliver this commendation personally," he said, each word measured, each syllable echoing across stunned faces, and he opened the envelope with the care reserved for documents that carried the weight of sacrifice and honor. He read the citation aloud, the name Captain Blair Harlow repeated, in a tone of respect none of my family had ever used, his voice detailing the classified operation I had led. The casualties prevented the tactical brilliance noted by superiors and the unanimous decision to nominate me for the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, one of the highest distinctions granted for exceptional joint service. The room reacted in ripples, a few gasps, then a silence so deep it felt like gravity itself had paused, and the earlier mockery dissolved into a thick, heavy awe that left my relatives staring as if the air had been knocked out of them. Some exchanged nervous looks, others shifted in their seats, trying to reconcile the woman on the stage with the version of me they had chosen to believe. And Kayla's mouth hung slightly open, as if each sentence pierced the fragile illusion she'd built around herself. My mother's expression shifted from disbelief to dread, her eyes widening with each line of the commendation, as if realizing the consequences of the lies she had spread. When Ross finished reading, he refolded the document slowly, then turned his attention not just to me, but to the hall itself, scanning the rows of stunned faces with a gaze sharp enough to cut glass. And then he delivered the words that would fracture the room entirely. "She is the youngest architect of Operation Northern Veil. Without her 18 soldiers would be dead." The room exhaled as though those words had punched the breath from every chest, and a wave of silence broke over the tables. Not the uncomfortable kind from earlier, but a deep, reverent stillness that felt almost ceremonial, the kind that filled command tents after receiving news of survivors against impossible odds. Eyes shifted to me again, but this time not with ridicule or suspicion, instead with a mixture of shock, respect, and a dawning realization that every assumption made about me had been wrong, painfully wrong, and I felt the weight of their stares without letting it penetrate the calm that had settled over me. I stood straighter, allowing the truth of my identity to claim its space in a room that once tried to erase me, and for a fleeting moment the contrast between who I was to them and who I was to the world felt almost surreal. My mother's hand tightened around her wine glass until her knuckles whitened. Kayla stumbled back a step as if trying to distance herself from the impact of Ross's words. Aunt Marion lowered her gaze to the table, unable to meet mine, and the cousins who had laughed earlier stared as if willing themselves to disappear. Colonel Ross looked back at me with the faintest nod of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of survival and accomplishment that needed no explanation. And in that moment, I understood that everything my family had tried to strip from me had been restored in a single sentence, spoken by a man who saw me clearly, fully, without bias or resentment. That was the moment the room broke, not loudly but quietly, with the realization that the story they had built around me had collapsed under the weight of truth. And as I stood on that stage, the shift in power settled over the hall like a second skin, undeniable and irreversible. The silence that followed Colonel Ross's final words still clung to the air when the room began to shift in small, collapsing motions, subtle at first like a structure losing its balance, and then more visibly as faces twisted with panic and forced smiles, each person scrambling to reinterpret everything they thought they knew about me, now that the truth sat undeniable in front of them. The first to break the paralysis was Aunt Marion, who rose so quickly. Her chair screeched across the floor, her earlier disdain evaporating into frantic eagerness as she hurried toward the stage, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Her voice trembling with a sugary excitement that had never once been directed at me before as she said, "Blair, honey, let us get a photo together. This is such a proud moment." Before she could take another step, one of the soldiers positioned near the entrance intercepted her with a firm but respectful gesture, making it clear she was not permitted to approach without authorization, and she froze mid-stride, her face flushing a deep, embarrassed red as she stammered something about being family, while the soldier remained motionless and unmoved. The rejection hit her harder than she expected, and she backed away slowly, her smile cracking at the edges, the reality settling in that the access she once assumed she was entitled to no longer existed. My mother, meanwhile, tried to seize control of the spreading humiliation by stepping forward with a desperate brightness in her voice as she declared to no one in particular we always knew she was special, the words coated in false pride dripping with the kind of insincerity that comes from someone trying to rewrite an entire lifetime in the span of a single sentence. Colonel Ross turned his head slightly at the sound of her voice, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carrying a glint that bordered on amused disbelief, the kind of reaction a man gives when hearing something so blatantly untrue that it almost becomes comedic. I felt the weight of his glance lingering a fraction longer than necessary, as if acknowledging the lie without speaking it aloud, and the absurdity of my mother's attempt to claim me in victory after discarding me in defeat pulled something sharp inside my chest. I looked at her, then letting the quiet settle between us, and when I finally spoke, my voice was low, steady, and stripped of anything resembling pleading, saying, "Do not please," the two words simple, yet heavy enough to freeze her, where she stood her attempt at performance crumbling beneath the refusal. She opened her mouth slightly as if searching for a response, but none came, leaving her standing there with her carefully curated image slipping away like sand through open fingers. Around us, relatives began shifting anxiously as whispers darted across the tables, nervous glances bouncing between Colonel Ross, the soldiers, the stage, and the entrance. And when the faint flicker of camera flashes appeared through the glass doors facing the parking lot, the tension in the room snapped taut. Someone gasped softly, then another voice whispered, "Is that news media?" And a murmur of panic rippled outward as people pressed closer to the windows. The unmistakable logo of WSMV4 Nashville, visible on a camera tripod set up just outside the hall, the crew gathering footage of the Humvee, the soldiers, and the unexpected military presence in the middle of a family reunion. A cousin near the front table hissed into her phone, telling someone to delete a post immediately. Another tugged his jacket over his face as if hiding would erase the possibility of being recorded, and Kayla stumbled backward in alarm, her earlier arrogance dissolving as she realized that every insult, every lie, every whisper spoken tonight might now exist in the background of footage picked up by a local news station, hungry for a headline. The panic grew thicker as people began adjusting their clothes, smoothing their hair, forcing smiles they had not worn earlier, their minds clearly scrambling to calculate how this situation could affect their reputations and social circles, because nothing terrified them more than being associated with behavior that might be captured on camera. Even my mother faltered, her composure unraveling as she glanced wildly between the windows and Colonel Ross, her voice trembling as she muttered, "Why would the news be here? What are they filming?" as though the answer were not standing directly on the stage in front of her. Ross kept his posture steady, his face unbothered, his presence radiating a calm authority that only intensified the chaos around us, and watching my family spiral under the pressure of being seen through a lens they could not control felt strangely poetic, a small taste of accountability for the years they had spent crafting false narratives about me. I remained on the stage silent and still feeling the shift in the room settle deeper, the balance of power tilting irrevocably away from those who once wielded it so casually. And though my heart still carried the sting of their cruelty, I no longer felt small beneath it. The exposure was not mine. This time, it was theirs. And as they scrambled to hide from the cameras outside, I understood that this moment, the unraveling of their perfectly curated image, was only the beginning of the consequences they had earned long before tonight. I stayed on that stage long enough for every set of eyes to feel the shift, and once the shock tightened its grip on the room, once every whisper had turned into a frantic scramble to protect their own image, I stepped down quietly, moving through the hall with a calm that felt almost unreal, considering what they had done to me. But the calm came from one truth I had carried for months. The truth that everything unraveling tonight had already been set in motion long before any of them realized it. For months, I had gathered proof every insult that slipped from my mother's mouth and every mocking laugh Kayla recorded behind my back, every message in which they dragged my name through the dirt to relatives, every lie they told about my work, my service, my rank, all of it collected in a quiet folder, locked inside an encrypted drive. And while they believed I was too busy deployed overseas to know what they were doing, I saw everything, because Aaron, the youngest, the only one who ever treated me with something close to respect, had forwarded me every screenshot, every voicemail, every whispered conversation she overheard as the family turned me into a punchline. There was one clip that hardened me more than any other Kayla's voice, sharp and cold, as she told someone on speaker it would be better if she were dead. She ruins everything. And hearing that sentence the first time left me staring at my laptop in the barracks, unable to breathe for a full minute. Then something inside me settled like steel, forming under pressure. And I knew I would not confront them with shouting. I would confront them with truth. So now, as the hall buzzed with panic and embarrassment, I pulled Erin aside near the service door, her eyes wide because she had seen Colonel Ross enter just like everyone else, and she whispered, "Blair, I had no idea you were someone that important," and I told her softly, "You were the only one who never treated me like a joke, so I'm trusting you with something." Then I handed her the drive I had prepared for this exact night. She opened the first folder, saw the messages, saw the videos, saw the audio files, and the color drained from her face as she whispered, "This is everything." And I nodded because it was, and she understood without being told what to do. Erin stepped back into the hall, slipped into a corner behind one of the decorative pillars, and within seconds the family group chat dinged across 200 phones, and people around the room reached for their screens, only to freeze one by one, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror to disbelief as Erin's uploads played automatically the videos of Kayla laughing at my uniform, the recording of my mother saying, "Blair is an embarrassment. I told people she died because it's easier," the screenshots of conversations where they called me unstable and dramatic and desperate for attention. The room fell into a suffocating silence, then erupted in low, shocked murmurs, cousins staring at each other with wide eyes. Because they had believed the lies for years, relatives blinking back embarrassment as they realized they had repeated those same lies at gatherings, and slowly people began moving away from my mother and Kayla, as though distance could protect them from the fallout. The panic grew sharper when I watched two women from the local Women's Civic League enter the hall, both still wearing their name tags from the community event they had left early, because I had sent them a separate message before coming to Knoxville, including the documentation proving that my mother had been using my military service to elevate her own standing, listing herself as mother of a fallen service member in private circles to win sympathy votes within the organization. And one of the women approached my mother with a tight jaw, speaking quietly but firmly. And whatever she said caused my mother's face to collapse inward before she rushed toward the exit with her hand pressed over her mouth. I felt nothing watching her leave, no satisfaction, yet only a quiet awareness that this was step one. Kayla tried to follow, but was stopped immediately by someone from the committee overseeing her design grant, because I had already contacted them earlier in the week to revoke the letter she had been using to claim military family status in order to gain priority approval. Her face pale as she attempted to explain, but they shook their heads slowly and stepped away. For the first time in my life, I watched her stand alone, no mother shielding her. No relatives circling her like she was the sun of the family's orbit, just Kayla, and the truth finally reaching her in full force. Relatives began whispering things like, "I didn't know she said those things, and how could they lie about her being dead, and maybe Blair wasn't the problem?" And their discomfort swirled around the room, like smoke growing thicker, as Aaron continued posting clip after clip, until no one could pretend anymore. But even then, they still did not understand that this was not the real impact, that this was merely the first crack in the foundation they had spent years building. They whispered, they backed away. They avoided eye contact, but they had not been hit with accountability yet, not truly, and I could feel the weight of what was coming settle behind my ribs, a slow burn, steady and inevitable. The room pulsed with a new energy, the beginning of fear, the beginning of consequences, and though they felt the shift, they did not yet grasp the scale of it. And as I stood there watching them panic and process and turn on each other, I knew what they didn't know, that everything so far was only the surface. A faint ripple compared to the wave that was about to crash over them once the truth spread beyond these walls, because tonight was not the end, it was the ignition. I knew the first wave of consequences would hit them hard, but the true reckoning always comes when the outside world, the world they used to impress and manipulate, finally sees the truth without the sugar coating they relied on for years. So the morning after the reunion, I sat at my desk in the small temporary quarters assigned for my leave in Fort Campbell and drafted each letter carefully, writing in long, measured sentences that explained succinctly but firmly how my mother and Kayla had falsified military affiliations, misrepresented my service, and repeatedly used my name to elevate their status in community spaces, while simultaneously degrading me in private and attaching the full documentation that proved their actions were not misunderstandings or emotional outbursts, but deliberate patterns of deceit. I sent the first letter to the Knoxville Women's Civic League, where my mother had been president for 3 years, listing accomplishments she gained by claiming to be the grieving mother of a soldier who had died in active duty. And I explained that not only was I alive, but I had never permitted my service to be used for any public recognition. And within 4 hours, the league director responded with a curt and professional message saying the board had voted unanimously to remove her from all leadership and revoke her membership pending formal review, and I sat back in my chair, feeling nothing like triumph, only a quiet sense of inevitability, because when you build your reputation on a lie, it collapses the moment truth touches it. Next came Kayla's turn, and I wrote an official notice to the Regional Community Arts Board, where she often volunteered, including the evidence proving she had applied for grants using the narrative of supporting a military sibling, a narrative she crafted specifically to gain favorable review, and the board responded the next day informing me that her volunteer status was suspended for 12 months, and all of her pending applications were void due to ethics violations. And while part of me expected to feel at least a flicker of satisfaction, what I actually felt was a deep exhale, like I had been holding something inside me for years, and it finally loosened. But consequences never stay private in families like mine, not when pride is the currency they guard more fiercely than honesty. And it took less than 24 hours for one of my aunts to call me. her voice trembling with anger as she said, "They said you blackmailed them, Blair. They said you threatened them with made-up recordings to ruin their lives." And I almost laughed because it was so predictable, so textbook that even caught in blatant lies. Their first instinct was not to admit wrongdoing, but to paint themselves as victims, fighting against my cruelty. Instead of defending myself, I simply said, "Check your messages." And before she could respond, I ended the call and uploaded the entirety of the evidence folder to the extended family group chat, the same chat they had removed me from 2 years earlier after a heated argument where my mother told everyone I was unstable and dramatic. And within minutes, the chat exploded with notifications because Aaron had already warned me this group still gossiped daily and that they watched the reunion fallout unfold with a mix of confusion and discomfort. And now the truth was landing in their laps with no room to twist or excuse it. I knew simply sending the files would not force accountability because families like mine excel at denial. So I went one step further and scheduled a mandatory Zoom meeting using the group's shared calendar, labeling it Family Review and Accountability Conversation. And although the title made my stomach twist with the absurdity of how formal it sounded for a family discussion, it served its purpose. Because when the time came, 30 people joined the call, faces framed by kitchen lights and living room lamps, eyes wide and stiff with the kind of dread reserved for moments when illusions are about to shatter. I joined last so my screen would appear at the end of the participant grid, giving them time to look at one another, wondering who would speak first. And before I unmuted myself, I watched the discomfort ripple through them. Mothers clutching coffee mugs, uncles rubbing their foreheads, cousins staring down as if reading something on their phones, just to avoid looking into the camera. When I finally spoke, I did so slowly, keeping my voice level, explaining that these recordings and messages were not isolated incidents, but parts of a long and intentional pattern that for years my mother and Kayla had created a narrative where I was unstable or imaginary or dangerous whenever it benefited them, and that the story of my so-called death was not an emotional mistake made during a moment of grief, but a strategic choice made to avoid embarrassment. And as I spoke, I saw their expressions shift from shock to disbelief to reluctant recognition, because some of them had heard pieces of these lies before, and now they were realizing those pieces formed a full picture they had ignored. One of my uncles finally unmuted and said, "Why would they do this to their own daughter and sister?" His voice shaking with genuine confusion, and I answered, because power means more to them than truth, because image means more to them than connection, and because for them I was easier to use as a story than to accept as a person. Then came the escalated twist I had been waiting for, the moment my aunt, from the night before, leaned toward her screen and said, "They told us you forced them to apologize at the reunion and you threatened to release these recordings unless they publicly humiliated themselves." And instead of arguing, I pressed a button on my keyboard and shared the audio file where my mother and Kayla spoke openly about lying, mocking, and wishing I stayed deployed forever, so people would stop asking where I was, and the silence that followed was thick and heavy, the kind of silence that only descends when the last thread of denial snaps. Several relatives began asking questions at the same time, talking over each other in a frantic attempt to reorient themselves within this new reality, some accusing my mother, some asking for context, some apologizing to me through the screen. But none of it mattered because this was not about earning their sympathy or forgiveness. It was about ending a legacy of manipulation that had shaped every part of my childhood and adulthood. I told them I did not need apologies, and I did not need them to pick sides. I only needed them to see the truth for what it was. And I ended the call before anyone could respond, leaving them in that digital silence to sit with the truth they had avoided for years. When I closed my laptop, the air in my quarters felt clearer, like a window had finally opened after years of stale heaviness. And while I knew more consequences were coming, I also knew that this second phase of my retaliation had delivered something deeper than punishment. It had delivered clarity. and now that clarity was spreading through the family like a slow, inevitable wildfire that none of them could outrun. They always come back when the world stops feeding their ego, and 3 days after the Zoom call detonated every lie they had carefully planted across the family tree, I saw their names appear on the visitor log at Fort Campbell, the ink still fresh because they had arrived before sunrise, and I remember staring at the sheet for a long, quiet moment, feeling nothing. No spike of anger. No flicker of satisfaction, only a stillness that comes when the balance finally shifts, and you realize the people who once controlled the narrative no longer even control the door they stand behind. I walked through the hallway toward my office boots, echoing against the polished floor, and the two of them were waiting on the bench across from the entrance. My mother clutching a soaked tissue, eyes rimmed red, like she had practiced the expression in the car, and Kayla sitting stiffly beside her with her chin tucked downward. And the first thing I noticed was how small they looked in a place built for discipline and clarity instead of manipulation and gossip. When they saw me, they both jumped up at once, their voices overlapping as if they were trying to outrun each other to reach my sympathy. My mother saying, "We did not mean any of it," and Kayla whispering, "Please help us fix this because everyone is talking and my friends will not even return my messages," and I kept walking, passing them without slowing, their words trailing behind me like fading echoes of a language I no longer spoke. My mother reached out and grabbed my sleeve in a desperate reflex, and I stopped only long enough to gently remove her hand, not harsh, just precise, and I told her this is not the place for theatrics. Then continued down the hall until I reached my office door and closed it quietly, leaving them standing in the hallway unsure whether to sit or follow. I sat at my desk, adjusted a stack of reports, and breathed for the first time that morning, because this was the moment the outline had promised, the moment when the people who had erased me would finally understand they could no longer use my silence to maintain their power. Yet I felt no thrill, only a steady sense of inevitability, as if the universe had simply caught up to a truth I had carried alone for years. After nearly an hour of reviewing mission files, there was a knock on my door, crisp and respectful, and Sergeant Willis stepped in with his usual calm expression, saying quietly, "Ma'am, they are still waiting outside," and I nodded without looking up, continuing to write notes on Operation Northern Vale's final assessment, letting the weight of my focus tell him exactly how much their presence mattered to me. Another hour passed, then another, and I heard no sound from the hallway except the occasional shuffle of boots, so when noon rolled around, I stood stretched and walked toward the exit to grab lunch before my briefing opening my door to find Sergeant Willis waiting with a slight frown as he said, "Ma'am, they have been sitting outside your office for 4 hours now," and I could see behind him that my mother and Kayla were slumped on the bench, shoulders hunched, eyes swollen not with grief, but with the shock of realizing their tactics no longer worked here. They stood up immediately when they saw me, my mother trying once again to speak first, while Kayla pressed her hands together like she was praying for mercy, and I simply raised my hand to stop them because permission was no longer theirs to assume, and the silence in the corridor thickened as every soldier passing by glanced quickly, sensing the tension, but trained not to interfere. My mother whispered, "Please, Blair, we cannot fix this without you. People think we are liars and cruel, and we are losing everything." And I let her words sit in the air for a moment, letting the desperation sink into the walls, the same way their dismissive laughter had once filled our home when I asked for the smallest slice of respect. Then I answered with a calm that surprised even me, saying, "Let them wait." I walked past them again, and this time the movement felt easier, lighter, as if I were stepping out of a shadow I had lived in my entire life. Because for the first time, they were confronting the consequences without controlling the narrative or the audience or the story. As I headed toward the cafeteria, I thought about the years I had spent trying to earn their approval, The years I had swallowed humiliation so deeply it calcified into something sharp enough to cut through any illusion they still clung to. And it struck me that they were not here to apologize or understand. They were here because embarrassment had come knocking on their door. And without my silence, they had nothing to shield themselves from the truth. I knew the moment outside my office was only the beginning because people like them do not crumble all at once. They crack, slowly trying to glue each fracture with excuses until they no longer recognize the pieces they are trying to hold together. And the longer they sat on that bench, the more they would realize the one thing they had never considered, that I no longer needed them to acknowledge me in order for my life to make sense. When I returned from lunch, they stood again, hopeful and without looking in their direction. I opened my office door, stepped inside, and let it close softly behind me, leaving them suspended in that limbo between entitlement and consequence, a place where every manipulation they had once relied on became weightless and useless. I sat at my desk and resumed my briefing notes steady and unbothered, knowing this was the purest form of justice. Not dramatic, not shouted, but quietly undeniable. And when Sergeant Willis walked past my open door later and glanced in for instruction, I repeated the same simple phrase that had become the turning point of this chapter. Let them wait, because sometimes the most powerful revenge is forcing the people who erased you to sit with the truth long enough to realize you will never shrink again to fit their expectations. The fallout spread faster than even I expected, and within a week the consequences that had once seemed impossible for my mother and Kayla to face finally settled onto their lives with the weight of something irreversible, because the community that once praised them for their charm and social involvement now kept its distance in a way that was unmistakable. Doors that were always open to them quietly closing as neighbors who once admired their curated stories realized those stories had been stitched together with lies, and my mother, who used to glide through Knoxville events like she owned every room, found herself uninvited, ignored, and in some cases directly confronted by people who had watched the Zoom meeting and heard the audio for themselves. Kayla felt the impact even harder because the nonprofit she worked for relied on public trust and reputation. And when the board received the documentation about her falsifying grant applications and using military connections she did not have, they terminated her employment with a single formal email, leaving her stunned and silent for the first time in her life. And Erin told me she cried for 3 days, not from regret, but from the humiliation of losing her social identity. The wider family reacted as predictably as a storm pattern, because the elder relatives began calling each other asking how such things could have gone unnoticed for so long. And the cousins who used to snicker whenever Kayla mocked me now avoided my mother, entirely refusing to allow their children near her at gatherings, whispering that anyone who could lie about their own daughter dying was capable of lying about anything. And the estate discussions that had been quietly brewing for years shifted dramatically because several relatives demanded that my mother and Kayla be removed from all inheritance conversations, citing the deception as proof they could not be trusted with family assets or decisions. Through all this, Erin stayed firmly at my side, sending small updates and gentle messages, because she sensed how complicated my emotions were, even if I did not voice them. And one evening, she called to tell me she had finally filed a formal statement about years of emotional manipulation and gaslighting that our mother had directed at both of us. Her voice trembling, not with fear, but with relief, saying she should have spoken sooner. But she never felt safe until now, and I told her she had done the bravest thing anyone in our family had ever done. Yet even as their world was cracking apart, I knew there was one final step that would bring the truth into full daylight, not for revenge, but for accountability. Because impersonating military affiliation for personal gain is not something the Army treats lightly. And my mother had spent years using my service as a prop, while simultaneously shaming me for choosing the career that gave her the social leverage she craved. So I sat down at my desk late one night with the barracks quiet around me, the distant hum of vehicles on the training field creating a steady backdrop, and I drafted the military misrepresentation report with the same precision I used when planning operational scenarios, laying out each instance where she claimed I was dead, each event where she presented herself as a grieving mother of a fallen soldier, for recognition and status, each time she used my rank to gain influence, while publicly denying my value as a person, and when I attached the recordings and screenshots as evidence, a calm certainty settled over me like a final piece, clicking into place. I submitted the report through the proper channels just before midnight, the screen glowing softly in the dark room, and I knew this action would move the situation out of the private sphere and into the realm of formal accountability, where excuses could not soften the facts and intention no longer mattered more than impact. The next morning I received confirmation that the report had been received and flagged for civilian investigation. And although I did not celebrate, I felt a release deep inside me, a loosening of something I had carried since childhood. Because for the first time, the weight of their choices no longer rested on my shoulders. I did not tell Erin immediately, choosing instead to wait until she visited the base a few days later, and when we sat together under the shade of a tree near the training grounds watching soldiers run drills in the distance, she asked quietly if I felt any guilt for how far things had gone, and I told her the truth, that guilt only exists when someone acts out of cruelty rather than clarity, and everything I had done was not to destroy them, but to stop allowing them to destroy me. As we sat there, I realized the final consequence was not the investigation or the lost positions or the collapsed reputation. It was the transformation that followed the way the truth had finally become louder than their lies, reshaping the family landscape in a way that could not be undone. And for the first time in my life, I was no longer the shadow behind Kayla or the disappointment beneath my mother's thumb. I was simply Blair, a woman who stepped out of the dark tunnel and allowed the world to see what had been buried for years. Returning to the training fields at Fort Campbell felt like stepping back into the rhythm of a life that had always made sense to me. And as I walked across the open grounds with the late afternoon wind pushing softly against my uniform, I saw soldiers running drills in tight formation, their voices carrying across the air in sharp, coordinated calls, and something inside me settled in a way that no family apology or explanation ever could. I paused near the edge of the field where the grass rippled in long strokes, watching the unit sweep past in perfect alignment. And as the wind brushed against my face, I whispered to myself in a voice barely louder than a breath that my value was never theirs to define, letting the truth sink deeper than it ever had before, because it was no longer just a phrase, it was a recognition, born from surviving the long, slow erosion of identity and finally stepping out of the storm. Commander Ross approached from behind me with his usual calm stride, his hands clasped behind his back, and he stood beside me for a moment in silence, watching the drills with the thoughtful expression he always wore after a field assessment. Then he said, "Captain Harlow, you have handled this entire ordeal with more discipline than many officers twice your age." And I turned slightly waiting, sensing he had come with something specific. He looked at me with a rare softness in his eyes and said, "I am recommending you for early promotion review. Your record and your composure speak for themselves." And for the first time in months, I felt a swell of quiet pride that was entirely mine, not diminished by anyone's opinion or expectation. I thanked him steady and sincere, and he nodded before walking back toward the main building, leaving me standing in the sunlight that stretched across the parade field. And in that moment, I realized the future I wanted no longer depended on whether my family accepted me or acknowledged me. It depended only on what I chose to build. A week later, I drove to Clarksville to meet a realtor near a small plot of land that overlooked the river, a place quiet enough to breathe, but close enough to the base for early morning briefings. And as we stood together looking over the open space dotted with tall trees and long grass, I could already imagine the home I would build there, not large or extravagant, just a place filled with peace. Instead of expectation, a space that belonged to me entirely. I signed the initial paperwork that day, my hand steady, my mind clear, and when I left the office, the evening sun was sliding down behind the distant rooftops, washing the entire sky in soft amber light that felt like a quiet blessing. Erin called as I sat in my truck watching the sky shift colors, and when I answered, she told me she had driven past our mother's house that morning and noticed several neighbors turning away. When she stepped outside, their expressions unmistakable, and I could hear in Erin's voice that she felt torn between sadness and justice, the way anyone would when the truth finally forces itself into places long protected by image and denial. I told her gently that we cannot carry their consequences on our backs anymore, and she exhaled slowly, asking if we could meet for dinner the next time she visited Clarksville. A few days later, she arrived and we sat together at a small restaurant near the river, the kind with warm lighting and music low enough to hear each other breathe, and she told me stories she had never shared before, moments where she too had been reduced to nothing by our mother's sharp words, moments where she was told she was overly emotional or dramatic, simply for wanting validation, and as she spoke, I saw the weight lift from her shoulders the same way it had lifted from mine the moment I stopped trying to fit inside a family narrative built entirely without me. After dinner, we walked along the water, our steps unhurried, our silence comfortable in a way it had never been before. And she told me she wanted to rebuild a sense of family with me, something real and mutual and untainted by comparison or control. And I realized that sometimes healing does not come from repairing what is broken, but from creating something entirely new with the people who choose you rather than the ones who claim ownership over you. Weeks passed. The investigation progressed quietly in the background, and life at the base returned to its usual structured rhythm. Morning briefings, training exercises, strategy sessions, where my role as a tactical architect allowed me to guide missions with the precision and calm that had earned me my reputation long before my family ever learned my rank. Every day I stood on the grounds or walked through the corridors, feeling more like myself, stronger, clearer, no longer carrying the invisible ache of wanting a place at a table that had never been built for me. One evening, while watching the sunset over the new land I had purchased, I realized that the poetic justice was not that my mother and Kayla lost their status, or that the community saw the truth. The justice was that I no longer needed any of them to validate a life I had fought to build, and the healing was that I had chosen myself without hesitation. As the last light faded and the sky turned dark above the river, I felt something settle inside me, a quiet peace that had eluded me since childhood, and I knew I had stepped fully into a future defined not by their absence, but by my presence. And if someone were to ask how I survived being erased by the people who were supposed to know me best, I would tell them this, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to walk into your own life without looking back. Because the people who tried to shrink you cannot follow where you grow. Have you ever been erased by your own family? Tell me your story below.